Last week when I was presiding at the service, I was watching that clock, and I realize now it's actually 10 minutes slow. I was wondering why the service was shorter. Thank you for inviting me back. My year this year is to study people of faith and to study faith itself. And I've been reading a lot of Paul, the Apostle, working through the works of Paul. I figured that I wasn't old enough to understand Paul, that I had to be older to understand his journey and his struggle, and that I had to be in ministry for many years to be able to understand what Paul was trying to say with such intensity. I've also been studying liberation theology, which was a movement that came out of in South America, and people trying to regain the faith and rename it and speak it again. And now I'm looking at David. I've had a great week studying David and getting ready for this moment. But let me go backwards for a minute. Last week I talked about Hannah. Hannah believed that God would give her the son that she wanted desperately if she promised to sacrifice that child and give that child away to Eli to be raised as a spiritual priest. And then God would grant her other gifts. And when I talked about it last week, I talked about the notion of sacrifice is actually sharing. And you share things that are very personal and difficult to share, but then you share things that are easy. And that in sharing, in reaching out to each other, you are atoning. It's called atonement, which means, and atonement really means to be at one with, together. So for Hannah, to share with God meant that she realized that she wanted to always be at one with God, that God was part of her reality. And now we come to David. Let me talk about the Ark of the Covenant, because the Ark of the Covenant is central to the story of David and of Saul. The Ark of the Covenant is about 52 inches long, or 131 centimeters. It is 31 inches high and 31 inches wide. And it is made with wood, and then it's covered in gold. And in the Ark of the Covenant are the 10 Commandments. There's also some manna and Aaron's staff. You remember the story of Moses and Aaron? Aaron's staff had power. So this is all in this box. And on top of the box, there are 2 angels. And on the sides of the box, there are golden loops, because no one was to actually touch the ark. And wherever they went, the ark went first, or in some cases it went behind, but it was believed that if you touched the ark, you would die, and that God was in that ark, and it was sacred. So just before the time of David, the Philistines and Saul, the first king of Israel, got into some wars. And they lost. Israel lost. The 4,000 men died. And they decided the second war that they would go to Shiloh and get the Ark of the Covenant and bring it in amidst the camp, amidst the battle. And when the Ark arrived into the battle, there was great cheering. And it said that there was so much cheering that the ground shook. And the Philistines heard this, and they were afraid. Now, the reason some commentators speak about why they brought the ark is because the people had lost, the high priests, had lost a sense of what the ark was. That in some ways the ark had become a good luck charm for them. So they brought God in as a good luck charm. And for some, they believed that if God was there, they'd never lose. because God wouldn't allow them to lose, because God would be dishonored. Strange thinking. Almost forcing God to do your will. And it's known that Saul kind of was impatient. King Saul was impatient and wouldn't really pay the respect to the Ark of the Covenant that was needed. And by this time, the only people who saw the Ark were priests or the king, and it was once a year. It was all covered in a tent. Strange image, right? Strange image that here is the Ark, the most powerful symbol of their faith, and nobody gets to see it other than a chosen few. The regular people, the everyday people, don't get to see it. So here is now the Ark, and it's among the battlefield. They engage in the battle. Now they lose 12 times 4,000 men. And it is said that the reason why they lost so many, even though the Ark of the Covenant is right there, was because they got too confident. And they thought, well, why really put your energy into battling? Because God's going to do it. But God didn't. And the Philistines were afraid and they were desperate. So they won the battle, and then they took the Ark of the Covenant. They took it away as spoils of war. They had it for 10 months, and apparently it wasn't great. They got boils and mice, and they gave it back to the Israelis. And it was no longer at Shiloh. It was now at another place. And Saul kind of put it away. The priest kind of put it away because it had lost its magic. Because they had lost. God hadn't saved them. God hadn't done what they expected them to do. When Saul dies, David, who has great respect for the Ark, goes and gets the Ark out of where it is stored and brings it halfway to Jerusalem. One of the first things David did when he was king was he conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites and started to create a new kingdom. So he wants this big Ark of the Covenant there with him. But somebody touched it, they died, and David said, okay, let's just put this aside for a few months. He went back to Jerusalem, he built a covenant tent, and then went back and got the Ark. And this time, as the Ark was going into the city, David danced. There was music, there was musical instruments. Everybody was alive with the joy, and David's purpose, I suspect, was to regain the respect for the Ark of the Covenant, but for God as well. This is God. One of the commentators I was reading said, we really should think about that in today's terms with our churches. That here we gather, holy God joins us. God is everywhere. But on Sundays, or when we walk into this holy place, that we should always be aware that we're walking into a sacred place. So this is what David was doing. He was reminding people that this is God, and God doesn't do what you tell God to do. So David builds this palace in Jerusalem on the sort of the hillside of Old Jerusalem, what is now known as Old Jerusalem. And he wants to build a temple. And God says, no. No. Your descendants. Solomon eventually builds that temple. But David accepts what God says, does not complain. His ego doesn't get in the way. But he does make sure that that Ark of the Covenant is sacred. And that people realize this is where holy God is. And then people started coming to Jerusalem. People started bringing their sacrifices. So let's think about David's faith. You know the story of David. You remember I remember hearing the story of David when I was a child, the shepherd king. And I realized recently that I actually think of him still as a young man, but he was over 60 when he died. But I still think of this gentle shepherd boy who, with great courage and with great tenacity and trust in God, was able to do things that others were stepping back from. But David trusted in God. David trusted in God. David had a relationship with God. Some of the work that I'm doing in studying that I'm doing in liberation theology that I mentioned was going back and looking at what does it mean when Jesus says the lilies of the valley, or what does it mean when Jesus says mustard seed, or what does it mean when Jesus talks about the pearls? What do the words of Christ actually mean in your life? Not what commentators say, not what other people give you as an idea, but when you hear them personally, what do they mean? Liberation theology, when it first started, was to engage the senses, to engage who you are, to engage your soul and your spirit into the teachings of Christ. Unfortunately, liberation theology got a little off track after that and got very political and got too lost its way, I should say. Lost that core sense. What is Jesus saying to me? David, we hold David up as this example of one who knew that God was with him. I remember getting in an argument with a friend of mine a couple months ago, and it was about David's sin. You know, David, he's on the rooftop of his palace that God has allowed him to build. He looks over, he sees this beautiful woman bathing on her rooftop, Bathsheba, and he desires her. He sends for her. She comes over, and she ends up being pregnant, and David panics because she is married to one of his generals, Uriah. And so he sends for Uriah. Uriah comes back from the battlefield because David is feeling so guilty. But Uriah, feeling so humble before God and before David, does not go home to his wife. He sleeps at the gates, at the city gates. So David's plan is now, that doesn't work. So he sends him to the front of the battle, and he dies. And God says to him, David, I have seen your sin. I have seen what you have done. And David repents, and then David rejoices because his relationship with God is one of an awareness that God is with him always. Faith is real. Faith is not an intellectual experience. Faith is not an out there. Faith is an inner, life-changing, thought-changing, emotion-changing experience. It is passion. It is deep, amazing love. It is courage. It is an awareness that everything around us is of God. And we are humbled before that. And yet we sing and we dance because we know that we are loved. That's the message of Christ. I'm going to leave you with the Helen Keller quote that I used last week, because I think Helen Keller grasps the idea of faith like nobody else does. Helen Keller said in her memoirs, I believe that we were created to live out courageous love, to learn to live out courageous love. I believe that God is in me as the sun is in the color and the fragrance of the flowers. And I believe that God is the light in my darkness and the voice in my silence. That is faith. Thanks be to God. Amen.